All right, we're back. It's time for Music and Stories 2. It's the best I could come up with aside from more music and stories. In any case, it's time to continue on with the story. I'm done with high school and I'm on my way to college. And that seems to be the next big section of my life. And it's taken me a really long time to write this and to come to terms with it. It's got a lot of exposition in it. There's more exposition and less narrative in this. Just because it sets everything up for the rest of my life, I realize, because when you do this kind of thing and you take notes and you kind of figure out where you are chronologically in your life, you see patterns and you realize that certain sections of your life surprise you with how they're not the way you casually remember them when you analyze them closely. Like high school, I was much more irresponsible than I thought I really was. And I really screwed up getting into college, which brings us to where we are. Now, I'd use the analogy of Thomas Wolfe's Of Time in the River, where he had gone up to college, to Harvard, and he met his faculty advisor in that person's office, and his office had more books in it than the public library where he grew up in North Carolina. And Thomas Wolfe marveled at the books and then noticed that each book had a bookmark in it. And there were marking passages that this professor, this esteemed professor, would always refer to. And that was the sum total of the knowledge of his life. He had read the books and picked out the passages that were important to him. And that's kind of what I really aspire to do, to show you the bookmarks of my life and take you through that story. So this is a good place to begin again because it's time to go to college. And as far as I was concerned, it was not a moment too soon. I had had a great summer in Israel and met my friend Ron, who was a lifelong friend, but things at home were a disaster. My mother and father were hardly on speaking terms. They were arguing all the time, and I really couldn't wait to get out of the house and head off to college, where I was headed to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Now, it's not the Ivy League and it was not the film school. It's the only place I got into. So let's be honest about it. Now, it's 170 miles from Franklin and Marshall to my home of Fort Lee, New Jersey. And as you can plainly see on this map, there you see where I am, and as a straight line, it's to Franklin and Marshall. Just a straight shot of 170 miles, New York City, civilization, Franklin and Marshall, Amish country. I don't know how realistic it is, but that's certainly metaphorically how it felt. There was nothing around it. But I was headed off there, and this is the cards I was dealt, and I was going to make the best of it. 158,000 people lived there in Amish country. Franklin and Marshall was an old all-male university. It was founded in 1787 and was the first co-ed school in America. And it was the first school to have a Jewish co-ed. So I should have felt at home. I should have been happy. That experiment didn't last more than 2-3 years. They got rid of the Jews and they got rid of the co-eds. And for the next 182 years, it was all male. And that's when I got there. It was still all male in 1966, in the fall of 1966. So we're going to cover fall of 66 to the end of the school year in 67. Now, it specialized in pre-med and pre-law, of which I was neither. I was the only place I could get in was to study psychology. Not much social life, which was dominated by the Greek fraternity system that they were very proud of, and which was something I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, okay? If it was anything that was anathema to me, it was fraternities. I mean, it had a really nice campus. There's a nice picture of it. And when I got there, here's my dorm. And on the first day there, I met my roommate. His name was Jeff, and he was from Forest Hills, Queens, and he was pre-law and really, really wanted to get into the best Jewish fraternity, ZBT. That was his goal, to get into ZBT. Now, we didn't have too much in common. I mean, except actually we both liked Lord of the Rings. And here's a reproduction of the map that we put up of Middle Earth. That was our first bit of decoration in the room. And unlike myself, I mean, Jeff liked music. He liked the Mamas and Papas. And this was used to hang in our room. I liked the Mamas and Papas, but Jeff had to adapt to the fact that I brought my record player, I brought all my albums, and he would be hearing a lot of music that maybe he didn't know. Here it is. Here's what our room looked like. Now, this wasn't right away. This is about 4 or 5 months into it. I had, there I am, my W.C. Fields poster, and by this time, I was already hanging up psychedelic posters. This one being the one that's on the wall, not this very same one, but a good duplication of it. And so this was to come, and let's not get ahead of our story, but I thought I'd show you the backdrop of where I aspired to go to. Now, the records that I was listening to, because this is called Music and Stories, you know, Blonde on Blonde, one of the greatest Dylan records of all times, which makes it one of the greatest records of all times. There are many people who feel it's his best record. I certainly love it. And the Stones, Aftermath, great stuff. The Byrds, Turn, Turn, Turn. The Young Rascals, okay. Remember them? Yeah, Good Lovin'. That was the kind of stuff that we were listening to. And this is one of my favorite albums. This is the Yardbirds, Over, Under, Sideways, Down. The Yardbirds had a big effect on me. Now, I was taking 4 college courses. Because I was a psychology major, I had to take Psychology 1, and I had to take statistics. Now, Psychology 1 mostly was involved with experiments, so to speak, on white mice, and you trained them to react in certain ways, and you imprinted them, and so forth, and you had to raise your own white mice. I had a whole bunch of mice that I gave names to of different groups and different rock stars, and you mostly raised the mice and did the experiments and did the work, but statistics was my downfall. I didn't realize that psychology wasn't just studying about crazy stuff. Yeah, it was statistics and experiments and group stuff, and so that was my nemesis. The other class that I took was Russian history, and that was terrific. I really liked Russian history. It was all these books, original sources and stuff. And here's some of the original books that I had from that course. My teacher was a really interesting guy. He was unlike anyone I'd ever met. He was perfectly collegiately dressed, so erudite, so knowledgeable, African American, and in retrospect, he was probably gay. But he had a different approach to classes than I had ever seen before. And so this is the beginning of the life education of Alan Arkush. Because this Russian history class was really important to me, because the first thing he said is, here's your textbook, we're not going to use it. Now, Fort Lee High School, you had to memorize the damn textbook. He said, just read the chapters as we go along, and they'll just give you a rough fill-in, because we're going to be reading about Russian history from the original sources, the original materials in translation from that periods that we go through, and then we're going to be reading the literature of the time. So we end up reading like the Brothers Karamazov. This is the original copy of it, and Turgenev and Yevtushenko. This was the kind of stuff we were dealing with. So this was not some lighthearted class, but it was. It's going to take about 2 or 3 hours a day to read everything that was required of me in this class. But that was not my favorite class. I love that class. But my favorite class, my joy, was Intro to American Literature. I was born to take this because it was a survey course, and the Russian history was a kind of a survey course. In a way, this video today is a survey course. It's the first semester of the rest of my life. And we're gonna build on it from there. Now, we had to, the American Lit course was like Poe and Emily Dickinson, right? And, you know, Thoreau, Jack London, Walt Whitman. There's Jack London and of course Walt Whitman. And the whole aspect to the course was that it was a study of something called transcendentalism. Now, transcendentalism was an artistic credo. I'm going to read a little bit from Emerson here about our new nation, meaning America, based on individualism, idealists, the divinity of nature. Instead of God within a church, God exists in the world like a gentle breeze, sublime to pleasure. Okay? Now, some of the records that I was also playing at the time, I didn't get to all of them. Fifth Dimension by the Byrds was their transition from the folk rock into the psychedelia. And this record has 8 Miles High on it, which was raga rock, and 5D, you know. So this was an outstanding record. So poor Jeff, and actually, he actually got to like this stuff, and I became the hangout room on my dorm floor. Now, the thing about the dorms there was that it's an all-men's school, so there was a communal bathroom on the floor. So if you wanted to go to the bathroom, you went down the hall, and if you were in the shower, well, you had to survive a lot of towel snapping, being freshmen, we got towels snapped on our butts and stuff. And then when you got in the shower, they would flush all the toilets at once and all the urinals. So the water would turn from cold to hot, and you would get scalded. But if you sang there, Sunshine Superman, Season of the Witch, The Trip, which drops the name of a lot of San Francisco groups, and The Fat Angel. This is an all-time classic record. And Ron Klein had recommended that I get this record, and he was right. Ron is a Kinks freak, and Milk Cow Blues is on it, and a song that's probably been covered more times by the Byrds, by other groups, the Kinks wrote, that other groups have covered, called Where Have All the Good Times Gone? And it's as true today as it was back then. So I had to do a paper on, where is it? I'll be right back. Okay. It's time to prove myself. Could I do college work? And the first thing that came up was a paper in American Lit course about transcendentalism. So I had to take some of the material we had or something that I found and talk about transcendentalism and what that meant. It's a pretty big challenge for me. So I was reading T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, the love song of J. Arthur Prufrock, which is a very, very famous poem. And here's the opening to it. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain deserted half streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights to one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. To lead you in an overwhelming question, oh, do not ask what is it. Let us go and make one visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And this poem struck something in me, in the language of it. And what it did was it reminded me of the lyrics to a song. Yes, to dance beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free, right? Silhouetted by the sea, circled by the circus sands, with all memory and fate, driven deep beneath the waves, let me forget about today until tomorrow. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle jangle morning, I'll come following you. That sounded like transcendentalism to me. Let us go through half deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights and one night cheap hotels. So I decided to write a paper on Bob Dylan, contemporary transcendental poet. Sound like a college paper to you? I really worked on it. I put everything I had into this paper. And I was pretty nervous when I handed it in. And then like a week later, he hands back all the papers and I look at what it is and it's an A. I got an A in it. And he asked me to stand up in front of the whole class and read my paper. It was such a moment of affirmation for me that my critical thinking was equal to that of college. It was like a big weight had lifted off me because all the problems I had in high school doing that kind of learning, that memorization, proved to be gone forever. Now I was coming up to a new intellectual blooming and I got an A and the whole class loved it, you know. So I came back to my room and I tell my roommate, I got, you know, the paper I did, Bob Dylan, Transcendental American Contemporary Poet, and because I got an A, he says, I knew you would because you see, you have discovered something that I like to call the Don Drysdale School of Scholarship. Now, Don Drysdale, does anyone know who Don Drysdale is? Okay, Don Drysdale used to play for the Los Angeles Dodgers. And he was a great pitcher. And my roommate Jeff had a really good friend who really was crazy about the LA Dodgers. He lived in Queens, but he loved the Dodgers, and above all else, he loved Don Drysdale, and he was obsessed with him. So whenever he'd get an assignment in school, he would make it about Don Drysdale. Get the point? So it'd be like a history class, contemporary American history. It'd be Don Drysdale, all-American hero, and what he means to our country today. Physics class, the calculus of the Don Drysdale curveball, right? How it flies through the air, an analysis. So I took this lesson to heart, and I have used the Don Drysdale theory of School of Scholarship for pretty much the rest of my life, okay? Now, at the same time as I was blossoming about this other stuff, I went to this record store in New York, and I was looking through the records and buying new stuff, and I came across a fanzine, a magazine called Crawdaddy. Now, Crawdaddy was printed on Mimeo paper and stapled together and sold in West Village record stores. And now, it's a magazine for people like me. I was shocked because when I read it, it read like a term paper, but was about the Rolling Stones. It was written, edited, and published by a Swarthmore student named Paul Williams. Now, Paul Williams went on to write many things and was the publisher of this. Wrote a book called Outlaw Blues, which is a collection of all his rock criticism. Rock criticism, I had never heard of such a thing. Rock in Crawdaddy was being treated seriously, enough to warrant close analysis. And when I got this issue, there was a writer in there by the name of Richard Meltzer, and he wrote an article about Hendrix's Are You Experienced album, but he compared it to the cave paintings in France, Nietzsche, Plato, and Jean Genet. Right? So all of a sudden, people are taking music seriously and analyzing it. And he actually wrote a book called The Aesthetics of Rock, where he defines things as if it was literature. You know, there are many books about the aesthetics of different subjects, Greek mythology and, you know, Greek language. Richard wrote this. I got to meet him in the 70s. Well, that's another story. Okay, so that one I loved, and I got this other issue here, and was a big article about the birds, right? And the guy who wrote this article's name is Sandy Perlman. And in it he writes, a girl listening to the Byrds version of Mr. Tambourine Man, a girl who loved Bob Dylan once said, I don't like it because it sounds like church music, meaning that she didn't like it because she didn't like church music. Now, this goes on for a whole lot of pages here, his analysis of why the Byrds sound like church music. And Sandy Perlman, all his stuff has been collected, but he went on to become a record producer, and he produced this great album by The Clash, Give Him Enough Rope. And then he went on to produce the Blue Oyster Cult, this album, and I can say with some certainty, now you should get out your pens and papers, that on this Blue Oyster Cult album, where he was the producer, he was the one who said, more cowbell on Don't Fear the Reaper. Sandy Pearlman, okay? So, Crawdaddy, this is a book of all the articles, to more cowbell, okay? Now, other rock critics came out of this whole period, the best of them being Lester Bangs, and if you have any interest in taking rock seriously or rock as a subject worthy of study, this is the definitive book, but this isn't about Lester, okay? There was this one writer who really struck me. His name was John Landau. And as I read these articles, it was the first time that I came across critical analysis of something that I thought I knew something about, okay? I loved rock, but their analysis was so much deeper than I did. It made me feel superficial to just accept pop culture without thinking of it. And this magazine challenged me to define what was really good, not just pleasurable. I was maturing a lot and becoming thoughtful, and like a lot of other boomers, I started taking high culture and low culture seriously. So this was an important change in my life, and that's why I'm spending this time on it here, because it was this one writer, John Landau, who really, really affected me. He had no patience for the San Francisco bands, but he wrote a lot about soul music and what made rock and roll great music. And he was a very thoughtful man. And he wrote this one passage, which is over 50 years ago, that has stuck to me to this day, okay? In an article about Otis Redding, he wrote, "It is the ethos of rock and roll that ties together all that is rock and separates from music which is not rock. I can only define the ethos in terms of the specifics, such as the guitar introduction on Johnny B. Good, or Bob Dylan's ah before the fourth verse of Like a Rolling Stone, or the Beatles screaming help, or Booker T and the MGs grooving, or Otis Redding ordering us to shake. These instances and 1,000 others are noteworthy for the fact that they are so much more than mere fragments of excellent recordings. They are united by a quality of transcendence that takes one beyond the immediate listening experiences. They are expressions of the totality of rock and roll." There is that word again, transcendence. And there were other people out there who found transcendentalism in music the way that I did. And now, Mr. Landau wrote for Rolling Stone magazine, and over the years I followed his criticism and so forth. And in 1974, he was writing for a Boston paper called The Real Paper. And he went to a show in Boston, and he wrote an article about that show, about the band that he saw that night, because he had an experience, a transcendental experience that would change his life, okay? And he wrote, "I have seen the future of rock and roll, and they are Bruce Springsteen." He saw Springsteen for the first time. Springsteen read the article, they met, they started talking, they became friends, and Springsteen was in a really tough place in his life at this point. He had done 2 records that were on Columbia, The Wild, the Innocent, and Greetings from Asbury Park, and neither one had sold anything, even though he had been signed by the most important A&R man in the history of music, John Hammond, who had signed Bob Dylan, Aretha Franklin, Count Basie. You know, this guy had great ears. He had signed Springsteen, but nothing was happening, and Springsteen was recording his new record, and it was not working, and he was spending a lot of money, and all they had was one song, and he saw his life flashing before him, and he needed somebody who was going to listen to the material and give him a fresh perspective on it. So he asked John Landau to come on down to where they were recording, and I think it was in Jersey, and listen to the tracks and give an opinion. And John Landau did, and gave him suggestions, and they started working together. This would be a partnership, a producer and recording artist that would go on for another 20, 25, 30 years. And this is the record that came out of John Landau giving notes, right? Born to Run, you know. What can you say? One of the greatest, you know, records of all time. Mr. Landau also produced the MC5, and I used one of the songs from a record he produced in rock and roll high school. The song's called High School, Jackson Browne, and every Bruce LP up until the 90s. Now, his records and his music have had a tremendous effect on me. So, Mr. Landau, if you're out there somewhere, I always wanted to meet you, okay? If anyone knows him, tell him to contact me. I want to take him out to lunch and talk about music and tell him what extreme importance he has been to me aesthetically in my life. Just thought I'd pass that on. So now, as you can see, I'm gathering this momentum of high culture and low culture. So I call up my father and I tell him I got an A. And he was remarkably subdued about it. And he asked me to come to New York City, get on the train, and meet him. And he sounded real serious. And so that's what I did. I rode in on the train on a Saturday morning and got to New York, and we sat down, we had breakfast. And he told me that he was getting divorced from my mother, and that the marriage was over, and he couldn't stand to be around her, and he didn't want to spend the rest of his life with a woman who was so intolerant of him and that he didn't have anything in common with anymore. Now, this struck me really, really hard, obviously, because I felt a lot of the same things. I had gotten into so many arguments with my mother. These last 2 or 3 years, life became intolerable, and in my senior year, we had gotten into such an argument, I had an enormous anxiety attack. You know, my heart was racing. I actually ran out of the house and did not stop running till my father drove, you know, and found me. And I got in the car, and he made a promise to me that this wouldn't go on any longer. And now, in a way, he was keeping up this promise. He was going to start a new life. And my poor sister would be living, you know, with my mother in Fort Lee, New Jersey. My father was going to live in New York. And the whole thing changed because whatever parent you were with, as people, children of divorce know, is the other one's the villain. And now we're being subjected to this. And by the time this day was over, I thought my head was going to explode because it was just a one thing, I was going to get back on the train. And we went up to Grand Central Station for me to take the train back there, and there was a record store, a little record place in the station, and I used a little leverage, and I got this record out of my father. Blues Project, which is a band I loved at the time, kind of a Jewish blues band. I think they're all Landsmen in this band. That's the talent in the band. His name is Al Cooper. Al Cooper played on Like a Rolling Stone and played with Dylan and played on Blonde on Blonde and started a band shortly after this called Blood, Sweat, and Tears and produced Leonard Skinner. And I still listen to music that he makes and read his columns. And the folk rock band that started signaling a big change in my life called the Jefferson Airplane. Now, this album had come out in August of '66. So this event was probably around October of '66. And I really, really liked this record. And this is before Grace Slick had joined the band. The lead singer in the Grace Slick role was right here, Cindy Anderson, and she was a couple of months away from, when this was taken, from leaving the band because she just didn't want to be a rock star, and Grace Slick joining. Actually, Grace Slick joined in October of '66. They went down to Los Angeles and recorded White Rabbit and Somebody to Love, and you know, the rest is kind of history. So now let's go back to Lancaster a little bit. So what am I going to do in Lancaster, Pennsylvania? Now you know my academic stuff. And basically what it was like was I'd read 2 or 3 hours in the library, you know. Then I would go up to the dorm and read in the bottom dorm study hall, and then up to the room. And I'd read with some music playing, and then at the end of the evening, we put on a record, and that's where Sunshine Superman and all that stuff kind of came in, and we play that. But that was what we did, and that was the, what the town looked like. And there wasn't that much to do on campus because I was not interested in fraternity life, and you can only go down to this place so many times, and there was a little amusement park which I was completely uninterested in there. So I got together. There was also only 2 movie theaters in town, and one of which played The Sound of Music the entire time I was there, which caused a traumatic experience for me because to this day I have not seen The Sound of Music because I'm still angry at this theater for running it every single day for 6 or 8 months. So I never went there. So a bunch of the guys and myself formed a little film club, sort of a film society. And one of the films that left a huge impression on us was Truffaut's 400 Blows. That's when you could order 16mm prints, and we'd about 20 guys, and we'd watch 400 Blows and talk about it. This Sporting Life, by Lindsay Anderson, which was the movie he made before If, and If is a movie that changed my life. And the movie that had more late night discussions than any other. What does blow up mean? Are they real? Why are they playing tennis without a ball? What do the pictures mean? Blow up was a big discussion topic in our dorm rooms, which is what we did, and we all fell in love with Rita Tushingham and A Taste of Honey. And I became a fan of hers, and she just had a personality and a style that I loved. Okay, so here's what the guys looked like that I hung out with on campus. The camaraderie in the dorm rooms, of these people who are not your typical Franklin and Marshall students, you can see the beginnings here of hippiedom, right? And sometimes some of them had girlfriends that would come down on the weekends, but basically, the weekends, you can only study so much, and on a Saturday night, you had to blow off steam. So, like all college kids, I discovered intoxicants, okay? Because college kids and intoxicants go together, right? You go to a college so that you can drink a lot of beer and drink liquor and act like a fool. And Pennsylvania had laws that they did not have liquor stores. They had state-run stores. And you had to go to a state-run store to buy alcohol. And they sold something in Pennsylvania that was not sold anywhere else. And here it is. It was 100%, 100 proof grain alcohol. So they wouldn't sell it to us. We would get an upperclassman to buy this. And this is straight alcohol. Have you had grappa? Because this stuff makes grappa feel like light sherry. Because when you drink this stuff, and how you can't drink it straight, you blend it with grape juice, and that was called a purple passion. 6 parts grape juice, 1 part grain alcohol. There is no high. You go directly from straight to drunk. It's the express lane. No stopping, okay? The other thing that we kind of liked drinking was this carbonated wine called Ripple. Now, Ripple came in 2 or 3 flavors, red and pink, okay? This is the Polynesian Ripple. Now, Ripple was a very celebratory kind of drink, and the Motown Review was coming to Franklin and Marshall, which they did. They toured all the campuses. We were pretty excited because we were going to get to see Smokey Robinson and the Miracles and the Four Tops, and we got this huge garbage can, and this is the dorm, the freshman dorm, and filled it up with ice and a couple of cases of Ripple. And I drank 2 bottles pretty quickly. And on my way to the concert, maybe had another one and another one after that. And I saw the Four Tops, but all I saw of Smokey was the toilet bowl in the bathroom. And that was the most drunk I'd ever been in my life. And somehow from there, under the influence of this Polynesian drink, I got to a place called Chi-Fi, which was the animal house of Franklin and Marshall, and they were having because it was a big weekend. You know, it was like a spring week, a fall weekend, homecoming weekend. All these girls were there and they were having a toga party. Let me just set the scene a little bit about the relationship between women and Franklin and Marshall, okay? There was none, all right? You lived in Amish country, so the locals couldn't even ride in an automobile. They were Amish. They had to ride in horse and buggies. So there were other women's colleges distant, so they'd bring in these young women in buses, and all the guys would wait for the buses to arrive and attack the buses and pull women out through the windows and off going to parties. That was not my idea of a good time, but that's what it was like. And I walked into this huge party that was going on, you know, and it was in my mind, it was a Polynesian themed toga party. I was pretty drunk and I was dying of thirst, and there was this huge punch bowl full of grape juice. And so I drank 2 or 3 of those Purple Passions. I really don't remember anything else until the next day. When I woke up in the afternoon, in fact, the entire dorm didn't wake up till 4 or 5 the next day. It was just one of those classic, college drunk experiences where people hung over all the way through dinner. Now, there's one last intoxicant that was available to you in Pennsylvania and nowhere else. And here it is, Romalar cough syrup, okay? You could buy this in every single drugstore with codeine in it, and you did not need a prescription. So what you do would be this. You would get your bottle of Romalar. Now, I had in my room a black light. It's probably overstating it a little bit. What I had was an empty, remember Noxzema hand cream? I had an empty Noxzema jar and a tensor lamp, and I'd put the Noxzema jar over the tensor lamp, turn on the tensor lamp, and there'd be purple light, and my psychedelic posters would glow. And you put a big stack of records on, on the record player. Remember those days where the arm would allow you to play the one side of each record? You drink your Romalar, lie down on the bed, and you'd kind of just sink into the bed till you woke up the next day. That was your Saturday night. Not that good an experience, but I tried it. The guy below me, in the floor below me, one Saturday night, drank a whole bottle of Romalar, got confused about the arm on his record player, and got confused about the door. He didn't put the arm right, so the record kept repeating, and he locked the door. So for 5 hours, we heard the first side of Pet Sounds over and over and over and over again. It's a great record, but 5 hours is a bit much. Finally, his roommate got there, and we got the door open. He left school shortly afterwards. But something was had to be done, because I couldn't just not do it, and I've always had a relationship to drugs and alcohol in which I just never really go too far. I mean, aside from the blacking out stuff. But once I've had that, I'm done. I see it and I might dabble with it, but it never controlled my life, and I needed to fill my life with something else. And I had heard that there was a college radio station, okay? And that radio station was called WFMC, Franklin and Marshall College. And I went down there and I thought, well, this might be really fun to work at a radio station, and play records and maybe be a DJ. And when I went down there to sign up, and I figured I'd get to talk to people who love music. Now, this is a 50-watt station, okay? Now, Murray the K, for instance, was at a 50,000-watt station. So this station, you had to plug your radio into the wall to hear it. The whole electrical system in the school was like the antenna. So you plug into this thing. And the people who were down there were not into music. They were into equipment. They loved the equipment. They loved turning the dials and all that stuff. Basically, the music was had to be taken care of so they could work all the equipment. So I got a job as a DJ right away. I mean, no one else was that interested in being a DJ, and I had the Friday afternoon slot because I never went to a fraternity party, and I played the top 10 for at least the first week. And there were songs that we would be playing would be Good Lovin' by the Rascals. I'm giving you a little context here. Happy Together, remember that? Turtles, Wild Thing, the Trogs, Penny Lane, Ruby Tuesday, Motown, Motown, Motown. And I never played ever the #1 song of the year. It was the Ballad of the Green Berets. And I'd play like Winchester Cathedral once, but after like a week of this, I started bringing in my own records and playing them, you know, because that was more important to me than the stuff. I started doing mixes, live mixes, and part of my love of making mixtapes came, here's some of them, came out of my experiences at this station, okay? This was really formative time for me because I started seeing the connections between different songs. And the station, I used to really look forward to it on Friday afternoons, and soon no one cared what I was doing up there. So they sort of let me stay on until midnight on Friday and play all night long. Now, every 2-3 weeks, a box would arrive with the new records from, I guess it was some sort of college distribution system, which would send records out to all the different stations, college stations, and we were supposed to go through the records and pick it what we liked and play all these new records. And there was always a lot of excitement when the box would arrive, and the senior in charge would open the box and everyone would stand around waiting to see what record, and they just pounced and they fought over the top record on this thing, which was the soundtrack to Thoroughly Modern Millie. Okay, so you're seeing there's a difference in taste between what I liked and what they liked. The next to go was Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, Bobby Goldsboro, Johnny Mathis. So they were fighting over this stuff, and they left me with the half-empty box of records. And I'm going through the records, and this record is in the bottom, next to the bottom. And there's a name on the cover that struck me as, I know this name, but I don't remember how. So I picked up this record, and I still have it today. This was at the bottom next to the bottom of the box. The Blues Breakers were John Mayall with Eric Clapton. That was the name that struck me because I had heard his name somewhere. Remember, there's no real rock press. It's just this Crawdaddy, newsletter. And this is where my beginning of love for Eric Clapton's music, his guitar tone, and I've talked about Clapton before, but it went from here to Cream, to his solo records, to Delaney and Bonnie, to Layla, which is one of my all-time favorite albums, and I don't like his Phil Collins stuff, but he's always had a tremendous meaning for me. So put this aside and looked at the box. There, at the very bottom of the box, is a record. Now you see how the cover is here? It's, it's got a lot of information. It's got all this stuff on the back, This came out in December of '66. At the bottom was just this album that kind of spoke to me. And it was just 4 faces of these guys with one word, the name of the band. And I turned it over, and there was nothing written about them. They just had this ominous stare, this thing that kind of went right through you. So I took the record out and took it back to the dorm. Break on through to the other side. Now, this happens to be a signed one by John Densmore because John was in Get Crazy. So I went back to the dorm that night, and when we were done with our homework, we put on this record, and we were lying down listening to it, and heard Break On Through to the Other Side, etc. And, it was a great record, and we started being completely caught up in it. And then I put on, Light My Fire came on, and now homework went down, and we really listened to it. And I looked at Jeff, and he said, turn it over. So we turned it over. On came the tensor lamp, the purple light, and on came this guy shouting like a wolf. You know, I'm a backdoor man, which is basically about anal sex in a blues format. And then came the song, The End. This is the end, my only friend, the end. This was a 10-minute epic song poem. And towards the end, he says that he wants to fuck his mother. And we had never heard an album like that. So the Doors went into heavy rotation at the station. Not so much the end, but other stuff, you know. I just was all over this stuff playing at the station, and I'd play a lot of Light My Fire, and then I bought this other record, Surrealistic Pillow, the perfect Jefferson Airplane record. I started playing White Rabbit and Somebody to Love. I was probably the first person to play this kind of stuff. And then the Kinks, Sunny Afternoon, and the Lovin' Spoonful, Summer in the City, and Mellow Yellow, you know, I'm Just Wild About Saffron, this band out of LA, the Buffalo Springfield. Loved them for what it's worth. There's something happening here. What it isn't exactly clear. All this rush of music and this change of culture in the world was coming to a head, it felt like, and I was starting to feel like, what was I doing in Lancaster? You know, and when I play this music, sometimes I get people calling me and complaining, why don't you play the hits? Why don't you play Winchester Cathedral? And when they did that, I would resort to Freak Out by the Mothers or Invention. There's nothing to quiet a person or make them even madder than a full side of Return of Monster Magnet or Help I'm a Rock. Help I'm a Rock will always get a reaction out of people. I mean, this is one weird record. So as I was feeling this stuff, I on Sundays would go down to town and get myself breakfast and go over to the newsstand because I would read the New York Times or the Herald Tribune, whichever would be there. I'd read them and it would give me a window onto culture out of Lancaster. And one day there was an article on the cover of the Herald Tribune, and what I would soon learn to be was psychedelic writing, okay? Now, it was written by my favorite writer of nonfiction, Thomas Wolfe. So let's take Tom Wolfe, different from Thomas. Let's take a little U-turn to Fort Lee High School study hall, okay? I would sit there in study hall and read magazines, which was great, you know? And I was reading Esquire one day, and this article about the stock car driver named Junior Johnson. And so I read the first page. Let me read to you the paragraph that set my head ablaze. 10 o'clock Sunday morning in the hills of North Carolina. And he's outside a big stock car arena where they're having the Charlotte 400 or whatever. Cars, miles of cars in every direction, millions of cars, pastel cars, aqua green, aqua blue, aqua beige, aqua buff, aqua dawn, aqua dusk, aqua malacca, Baker check cherry, nude, strand, colored cars, all going to the stock car races, and that old mothering North Carolina sun keeps exploding off the windshields. That's not nonfiction. That's rock and roll with words. So I started to read everything that Tom Wolfe wrote, okay? Every article I could find, he wrote about Las Vegas, which he said was architecturally pure as Versailles. He wrote about one of my favorites, Phil Spector. He called him the king of the teens. He wrote about custom cars and said that they were equivalent of modern statues, that Big Daddy Roth was a contemporary sculptor, not just a guy who made fancy cars. And this issue of Herald Tribune, he was writing about Ken Kesey. And Ken Kesey and a bunch of these people that they called the Merry Pranksters were taking a drug called LSD. Now, Ken Kesey had written One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I had read and liked very much. But now they're all taking LSD and having what they called acid tests, where things would go crazy. Now, they painted their bus different colors, and they went on this adventure. And every week, another chapter came out, and it was like reading Charles Dickens. Okay, it was like reading David Copperfield as it was written, because in this bus was driven by Neil Cassidy, the hero of Jack Kerouac's books. And Allen Ginsberg was on this bus, and there was a band that they had that were called the Warlocks that they didn't really separate themselves from the audience, and they played this music, and anyone could play an instrument, and it was thrilling to me. It was exciting. There was this life going on places. Here's a picture of the Warlocks. So they have a band like this. Some of the people have names like Mountain Girl, you know, and the Warlocks got pretty good, and they've morphed from being the Warlocks to being the Grateful Dead. Okay? So this had a huge effect on me. I'm thinking, what am I doing here in Lancaster? I mean, I love school. I was getting really good grades. I was getting A's and B's, except for statistics, you know. But something had to change here. I mean, I was not going to be here, and I decided I was going to leave Franklin and Marshall, and I was going to confront my parents about this over Christmas holiday, 1966. Now, I wanted to transfer to a really liberal college, you know, some place that, like Bard, you know, or Goddard, or one of these places where it seemed like what became the counterculture, the youth culture, which I was completely excited about, existed, and that was my goal. So I had to take control of my life. I had succeeded at a college level, and now it's time to go to a college which had some meaning for me, and I had really good grades, and I was going to go home and confront my parents with this thought. I wanted to transfer out of Franklin and Marshall College to a place like Bard, or go to film school. But if I had to return to Franklin and Marshall, I wanted to cash in all my bar mitzvah bonds, buy an electric piano, and start a rock and roll band. Those were the three choices. And when I went home for Christmas, all my friends were there, and I had made this decision and was going to confront my parents about it. So there you have it. That's the coming next week to this chapter is how Alan gets from here, Franklin and Marshall, to NYU, and what happened for the rest of that year. Okay? How's that for a good setup? See you then.